Describing energy transfers. This video is about how we describe when energy is transferred from one store into another. Now, an important note to make is that generally we use the concept of energy in physics in order to calculate other physical quantities. So for instance, if you had a ball being dropped, if you know the distance through which it fell, you can use the concept of the gravitational potential store and of the kinetic store to calculate the velocity of that object. So energy in these instances is a way in which we can calculate other properties. So we need to start by looking at some key points about energy transfers. We must first decide what point is the beginning. When are we considering as the start of this transfer? Then we need to consider what is the end point, and finally, how did energy get from one store into another? So, to help understand these points, we will look through several energy transfers. First of all, we have a man pushing a box. Now, if we consider the start point as before the man has pushed the object, then we can say that the energy store is the chemical potential store of the man. If we consider the end point as when the object is moving, then we can say that the energy store is the kinetic store of the object. Finally, how did this happen? The man applies a force to the object, so it's transferred mechanically. However, if we consider a similar system, only this time the start point is when the object is moving, that means we start with the kinetic store of the object. And if we consider when the object and man have stopped, then the final store is going to be the thermal store of the object. This is done by the force of friction. The force of friction does work on the object. Now we could also consider that the start point was before the man pushed the object, in which case the start point would be the chemical store of the object, and the end point again would be the thermal store. So by choosing the start point and end point, it gives us parameters by which we can use to describe this transfer. Next, the start point in this case is when the spring is squashed, so therefore it is the elastic potential store of the spring. The end point is when the velocity of the spring is its maximum, which means it's going to be the kinetic store of the mass on the spring. Finally, how is this transferred? The force of the spring does work. So the elastic force is able to do work on the mass. Next, a similar situation again, only this time when the spring is in motion is what we're considering the start point. So we're going to consider the kinetic store of the spring. And the end point is going to be when the spring has stopped moving. In this case, it will be the thermal store of the spring. How did this happen? Well, there will be something called a damping force. The force of friction within the spring damps the motion, which means it slows it down over time. It reduces the energy in the kinetic store and the elastic potential store. Next, we have a pendulum. So in this case, the start point we're going to consider as A, which means it has energy in the gravitational potential store of the mass. If we consider the end point as B, then we can say that it is the kinetic store of the mass. Finally, how did this transfer take place? The weight of the object does work over a distance to accelerate the object. So again, it's mechanically. It is the action of a force. Next, same system again, only this time the start point is B, the kinetic store of the mass, and the end point is going to be when the pendulum has finally stopped moving altogether. In this case then, the energy store will be the thermal store of the mass. How did this happen? The air resistance does work on the object, causing it to slow down. Right, this time we have a man with an angle grinder. So the start point is as the blade is spinning, so therefore it's the kinetic store in the rotation of the blade. The end point is the blade is in contact with the material, and so in this case it is the thermal store of the blade and the material. How did this happen? We had the force of friction. It does work to heat the blade and the material. In this case, the start point we're going to consider is a fully charged battery is attached to the circuit. That means we have the chemical store of the battery, and the end point is the filament in the bulb is glowing. So therefore, the end point for the energy store is the thermal store of the filament. How did this happen? The battery provides an electromotive force to push the electrons through the bulb. They collide with ions in the bulb, increasing its temperature. So therefore, work is done electrically. This time by heating. The start point is the Bunsen is turned on. This is the chemical store of the methane and the oxygen, which will then react in the flame. The end point is the rod increases in temperature. So therefore, the store is the thermal store of the rod. And finally, how did this happen? Thermal conduction between the hot gas in the flame and the rod. Next, a similar situation. The right-hand side of the rod has a higher temperature than the left-hand side. That's the start. So therefore, the thermal store of the right-hand side of the rod. The end point we're going to consider is the other end of the rod increases in temperature. So therefore, the thermal store of the whole rod is our final store. How did this happen? Thermal conduction along the rod. Next we have another one by heating. So the fully charged battery is attached to the circuit is our start point. That means it's the chemical store of the battery. However, this time the end point we're going to consider is the room has been heated. So therefore, the end store will be the thermal store of the room. How has this happened? Well, the transfer this time will be by heating. The air around the bulb has been heated by thermal conduction. And radiation. In this case, the start is the nuclear reaction in the sun, so therefore the initial source is the nuclear potential store of the sun. The end point is the Earth being heated, which is the thermal store of the Earth. How did this happen? Infrared radiation and light are radiated from the sun, and some is incident on the Earth. And finally, another one by radiation, but we're back to our battery and bulb again. The start is the fully charged battery is attached in the circuit. This is the chemical store of the battery. The end is the room has been heated. In this case, the thermal store of the room. However, in the previous case, whilst we had by heating, this time we have the light has been absorbed by the walls and they have increased in temperature. And so we have another transfer due to the bulb, which is the transfer by radiation.